Hello, everyone. Welcome to Archaeoviking and happy Black History Month. In honor of Black History, uh, I've decided to make 3 videos this month pertaining to important events in Black history. The event today that I'm making a video about is the Anglo-Cherokee War and the Cherokee and escaped slaves in the 7 Years' War. This event is very important because it had profound impact on the Cherokee and African Americans in the colonial era, and also had a immense impact on how the Cherokee and African Americans, one, lived and two, viewed themselves in the years coming up to as well as during the American Revolution. So first, who were the Cherokee? Well, the Cherokee are a southeastern American Indian tribe or nation. They call themselves the Cherokee Nation, all 3 of them, of which for the longest time lived in the southeastern area consisting of Georgia, Tennessee, etc., but now currently reside in Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Arkansas. And many famous individuals actually come from the Cherokee Nation. First, Sequoyah, right here on the right, who created the Cherokee writing system. And then you have right here David Vann, the cousin of James Vann, and uncle of Joseph Vann, both of whom were very famous Cherokee businessmen and men in the 1800s. And then you have John Ross, the longtime principal chief of the Cherokee during the 1830s well into the 1860s, and Major Ridge, a prominent military and political figure of the Cherokee in the 1800s through 1839. Of course, we're not talking about them necessarily today, as none of them were really alive during the First Anglo-Cherokee War, which ran from 1758 to 1763. First, let's look at what the Cherokee Nation looked like during this time. During the 1750s through 1760s, the Cherokee Nation essentially looked like this, encompassing large parts of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, parts of Virginia and West Virginia, and large parts of Kentucky. So a very large geographic area, and one of the largest tribes at the time, and still is one of the largest tribes to this day, despite all the horrible things that the U.S. government did to them. It was during this time that this Cherokee Nation became embroiled in what is technically our First World War. An event called the 7 Years' War. And as you can see in this map, it truly was a world war. The red areas are areas of combat. And it was an alliance, much like what we call World War I and World War II. And it was between 2 alliances of kingdoms or empires, with one alliance consisting of kingdoms and empires such as Prussia, Britain, and Portugal, as well as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or what most people call Iroquois, even though that's an improper term. And the other alliance consisting of kingdoms such as France, Russia, Spain, and even the Mughal Empire in India. Of course, the Cherokee participated in the North American front, specifically up around Canada. And what happened is the Cherokee and the British made an alliance or an agreement for the Cherokee to come help in the capture of several forts, including Fort LeBoeuf and Fort Dunlac, up in around Canada, Montreal, etc. And the Cherokee did actually go on these expeditions and did eventually help at least either raid or capture these forts. However, there began to be a strain between the Cherokee and the British Army. One, the campaign was very long and arduous and slow. It was very slow, and that's sort of what one of the main reasons the Cherokee were beginning to be disgruntled is the campaign was being so slow. They had been told it would be a rather short campaign, and it turned out to be not that way. And then two, the Cherokee warriors were beginning to be frustrated because they were away from home too long and were afraid they would not make it home in time for their grain corn ceremony, a very important ceremony marking the passing from, I believe, spring into fall, but I may be wrong, and any Cherokee viewers who see this, please feel free to correct me. But either way, they felt they needed to get home in time for this very important religious ceremony. And so the Cherokee, after capturing Fort Dunlap and raiding Fort LeBoeuf, decided that they had done their part of the agreement and that it was time to begin making their way back to Cherokee territory in South Carolina and Georgia, etc. Unfortunately, on their way there, they began witnessing a few retaliatory, I don't want to say retaliatory, a few raids, a few just outright raids and massacres. The first being essentially from a misunderstanding of South Carolina colonists, where they thought that the Cherokee who were returning home were horse thieves, or another suggestion, and hypothesis had been that the South Carolina colonists thought that they were Shawnee raiders, as the Shawnee tribe and other tribes had sided with the French, and South Carolina and other colonies had witnessed a few raids from these French-aligned tribes. But whatever the reason, these Cherokee who were returning were shot and killed, angering various Cherokee chiefs, including Moytoy of Sitico, not to be mistaken with Moytoy of Tellico. And at first, they did try to peacefully resolve the solution. They tried to get the colonists to try, or at least punish, the perpetrators of these killings, much in the same way in the 1670s that Pometicom, or King Philip, as you know, tried to get the Massachusetts colony to punish the perpetrators of killings of his tribesmen. And also, much like that, nothing really got anywhere due to a variety of factors, including disgruntlement at the Cherokee that was, in essence, straight out racism, disgruntlement at the British government for not being there when the colonists felt they needed them, etc., etc. And so more and more killings of Cherokee happened until about 33 over the course of several weeks, including the original, I want to say 10 Cherokee who had been killed to begin with, were killed over those course of several weeks. And so in response, Moytoy of Sitico began leading a bunch of retaliatory raids against very vulnerable South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia settlements. But despite that, there still was attempts to make peace, or at least to resolve the situation peacefully. And this was happening amongst several leaders at the time. Some of the main leaders of the Cherokee Nation at the time are the individuals you see here. There's Stota, who is a great Cherokee warrior, who definitely was more on the we should get punishment under the, punish these colonists and get revenge under the very traditional Cherokee law called blood law, which is very similar to the Huron and Haudenosaunee mourning wars, like as if you mourn a family member who has died. And then you had another very powerful warrior, Standing Turkey, who was the principal chief of the Cherokee at the time. And then you have Atakulakula, the figure in this next from the right picture. In it, he is the figure on the right, who was the youngest. And he was one of the voices of peace. He was one of the voices of, we need to resolve this peacefully. We need to work it out with the British rather than begin raiding. And then on the far right, you have another one of these war chiefs figures, Ustinako, who was also a very renowned warrior, and much like a Conestoga and Standing Turkey, felt that maybe peace with the British was not necessarily the best idea. Needless to say, they did still try to work out a peaceful resolution to these murders. That is until Wildton, the Wildton Expedition, happened. So this British general named Wildton marched with 1,000 soldiers into Cherokee territory, in which several Cherokee leaders went to meet with him in order to negotiate peace settlements. However, Wildton decided to take the 36 Cherokee delegates that came to meet him as prisoners, and then proceed to march them back to a fort called Fort Dobbs. This, of course, angered the war chiefs such as Ustinako and Oconostota. So the Cherokee began laying siege to Fort Dobbs, as well as other settlements. Fort Dobbs did not necessarily fall. However, they could not get out, and the militia in it could not get out. And essentially, we're just stuck in there. In fact, accounts talk about Cherokee snipers basically shooting anyone who stuck their head up. So in response, Wildton's successor, as Wildton had already marched back to South Carolina, decided to execute all 36 of the Cherokee prisoners, which, as you can guess, was a terrible idea. It was a terrible idea. I mean, they had already been stuck in the fort while various other militias and settlements had been burnt down and attacked. But now the Cherokee began to get serious. And in doing, and when they did that, they attacked a fort called Fort Loudoun that had been built in 1756 around the Cherokee village or city, however you want to call it, Chota, and proceeded to either take prisoner or massacre the inhabitants. This was a bloody defeat for the British, and they took over the fort afterwards. So in response, the British sent in another general named William Montgomery, who marched with another 1,000 British soldiers into Cherokee territory, only to meet heavy defeat and have many of his forces slaughtered. So he was forced to escape while his men were defeated. And then you have the final expedition into the Cherokee territory. And that is the James Grant expedition. The James Grant expedition, in response to the Montgomery expedition's failure, raised up a total of 2,300 soldiers, mainly British South Carolina colonists, but also a large contingent of Haudenosaunee warriors. And he also marched into Cherokee territory. Now, what is different about this expedition is the Cherokee didn't really engage James Brandt's militia, but a couple of times. They engaged them a couple of times and faced very minor defeats, if one can call them that, as they really just retreated. And all James Grant did was come across abandoned villages, about 17 of them, in what were called the lower towns of the Cherokee Nation, and set them on fire, burnt them down. And then he proceeded to march back to British territory and declare victory. Now, there's an issue with this. There's an issue with calling this a victory. One, he barely engaged the Cherokee at all. Two, the villages he burnt down were completely abandoned. Now, one could say, oh, well, the Cherokee abandoned these villages, so they retreated. No, not even a little bit. In fact, a lot of academics have noticed, including one paper I'll cite called Fortify or Flee, that the Cherokee developed this sort of hit and run hide tactic that they had used for centuries or millennia beforehand, but this is where they really developed it after an event known as the Tuscarora War. So the Tuscarora War happened about 40 years, 45 years before this war, 48 years before this war, and 1710, also in South Carolina. And in it, the Cherokee sided with the British again against the belligerents, the Tuscarora tribe, and their various allies. And what they saw is that the Tuscarora were inhabiting very well-built forts that were actually sturdier than European forts. However, they also saw that while these forts could hold out for a while, the fact that the Tuscarora didn't have any cannons or anything to arm these forts made them considerably vulnerable to more concerted British efforts. So the Cherokee felt it was better to abandon their villages and flee into the forest where they could fight guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics against the British. So with that in mind, to say that the Cherokee lost when they were using the very tactic that they developed to fight the British is wrong. I mean, again, the villages were abandoned. James Brant faced very little Cherokee resistance and returned after only burning already abandoned villages after 2 expeditions had been defeated and a British fort had been taken and slaughtered. Not really a victory. One could argue it was a Pyrrhic victory, as much of their Cherokees' food was destroyed and it did leave them vulnerable after the war, but a victory nonetheless. So after these expeditions and their failures and maybe draw in the term of the third one, but more like it's something that was relevant, an expedition of peace was sent, including a man known as Lieutenant Henry Timberlake. So this expedition explored all of the Cherokee towns listed on this map and basically brokered peace treaties with the Cherokee. And it is also thanks to this Timberlake expedition that we have this map of Cherokee territory. Now, of course, much like the Lewis and Clark expedition journals, not a lot of there isn't a lot of detail that happens in it. A lot of detail about the villages themselves, but where or how long it takes to get to the villages, not very much. Essentially, it's like, oh, we traveled 10 days past a mountain down a river to get to a tribe. So take what you can get from it. But it was still a very important expedition that we can get. It garnered a lot of information about the Cherokee society and helped bring an end to this war. Furthermore, Lieutenant Henry Timberlake brought 3 Cherokee emissaries with him to England in 1763 to help plead their case to the British king. These included Ostenaco, Atakulakula, and Standing Turkey. And the result of this expedition to the British Crown by the Cherokee resulted, along with the event known as Pontiac's Rebellion, resulted in essentially the Cherokee and the various tribes aligned in Pontiac's Rebellion getting what they want. The so-called Proclamation of 1763 that resulted in essence, everything west of the Appalachian Mountains being Indian territory. So what this means is that no colonists in Georgia or any of the other 13 colonies were allowed to settle in Indian territory across the Appalachian Mountains. Now, of course, this didn't mean they can eventually go west. I mean, as you see in this map, that Georgia or England could have taken over Florida, and it would have allowed them to get to this and could have still eventually resulted in, say, the Louisiana Purchase. Of course, that's not what happened, but still, but either way, this is the result of it. And needless to say, the British colonists were not pleased whatsoever, with the exception of James Grant, which is interesting because James Grant actually tried to negotiate for more concessions for the Cherokee. He felt that he had done his job, and he felt that while the Cherokee should definitely lose some things due to their antagonism, he also felt that they should get more, and that there should be more lenient treaty rights, because South Carolina, despite this proclamation of 1763, did get some rather one-sided treaty concessions from the Cherokee. This is part of my idea that it's a Pyrrhic victory, or a victory that's so costly that might as well be a defeat, but needless to say, it's still a victory. Of course, James Grant didn't get what he wanted to, neither did the Cherokee. Furthermore, despite this proclamation, British colonists began to migrate west anyway. One good example is Daniel Boone, who created Kentucky, the colony of Kentucky. So, unfortunately, that did happen, and it also made all the colonists rather angry, especially because they had fought the so-called 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and won it for the British Crown, and had gotten really none of the gains, which would eventually lead into the American Revolution. Now that we have the Cherokees covered, let us look at what was happening with African Americans at the time. Well, at the time of the Anglo-Cherokee War, Charleston, or Charlestown as it was called at the time, South Carolina, was one of the largest importers of slaves. It was one of the largest slave economies, and South Carolina was one of the wealthiest of the southern colonies. However, because of the Anglo-Cherokee War, slave escapes, runaway slaves, began to go up dramatically. And this led to a lot of fears amongst the South Carolina elites that another slave rebellion would happen. And this is because they had already seen a slave rebellion happen about 20 years earlier in 1739, known as the Stono Rebellion. The Sona Rebellion was a rebellion by African slaves who had been mostly imported from the Kingdom of Congo, a very powerful kingdom at the time, of which they consisted of Catholic converts, as the Kingdom of Congo had converted to Catholicism, who could also speak Spanish and Portuguese. And one of the main reasons for this rebellion is that the Spanish colony of France was offering asylum to escape slaves. And because these slaves could speak Spanish and Portuguese, they received this news fairly easily. Another major factor is that there was large epidemics of smallpox and such that led to many deaths of white elites and other South Carolina white settlers. So there was a decline in the white population, making them relatively weaker. And so in response, the leaders of the Sona Rebellion gathered and planned and started a rebellion on Sunday in 1739. On a Sunday in 1739. And the reason for this is because many white elites and white settlers were in church at the time and were largely unarmed. So the leaders of the Stono Rebellion went to the armories, gathered up all the weapons, and began killing white settlers and began to make their way to Florida. Unfortunately, while they did get a good chunk of the way, burning 6 plantations down and freeing more slaves, they did not make it, and the rebellion was brutally put down, with very few of them making it to Florida. And new laws were put into place that were stricter on slaves and required everyone who attended church to have a gun on them. So a rebellion like this did not happen. And so this is why when this rebellion is why when in 1758 through 1763, when escaped slaves began to increase in number, as you can see in the 1760s, South Carolina had more escaped slaves than any of the listed colonies here, as well as this figure where a lot of the runaways were actually fairly literate, about 6.9% versus earlier where they were 4.2% and 3%. They began to fear that another rebellion was going to happen. And many of these runaway slaves created what were known as Maroon colonies, or runaway slave colonies, where they would all band together to make communities because you're stronger and better off together than alone. In fact, around this time, it was another Maroon colony, not in South Carolina, but in Jamaica, that was causing a lot of trouble. The second Maroon War in Jamaica was going on at the time, and so this was one of the reasons the whites were having this anxiety. Is a slave rebellion already in one of the British colonies was happening, and because there were a lot of Maroon runaway slave groups in South Carolina, they were like, "Oh no, this is gonna happen again." One of the main belligerents was actually a man named Philip John, who was a free man of mixed African ancestry, who began to distribute flyers amongst slaves and runaway slaves in hopes that he could incite a rebellion of this level. So therefore feeding into the fears that a slave rebellion was going to happen. Now, eventually, Philip John and his conspirators were arrested and tried and executed. But this did not take away the fears, especially considering runaway slaves continued to happen. However, that does not mean that all slaves chose to run away. Some slaves, such as Abram the Unstoppable or Abram the Messenger, chose to actually join the South Carolina militia under promise of being freed. So Abram the Unstoppable joined because he had actually been taught by his master frontier techniques, which so made him a very valuable asset in the South Carolina frontier, as he was a trapper, knew how to track, knew how to shoot, etc. And he was known for being particularly brave and courageous. And this did eventually, in 1763, win him his freedom. Another figure who was and wasn't exactly as lucky is a figure known as Thomas Jeremiah. Thomas Jeremiah was a slave who worked as a ferryman and also as a militiaman during the Anglo-Cherokee War, who was able to gain his freedom due to his courageousness and the help he provided, and was also able to amass a rather large amount of wealth during this war as a ferryman, and eventually gain his freedom. Unfortunately, what was not so lucky for him is in the 1770s, on the eve of the Revolution, in an event that mirrors events that unfortunately still happen to black men, innocent black men, in the modern era. A white woman accused him of rape, of rape he did not commit, or at least most historians do not think he committed, and proceeded to take him and try him and execute him. So that is unfortunate, but he was able to gain his freedom due to his help in the Anglo-Cherokee War. However, this was not the case for everyone. In fact, most slaves who were promised freedom, if they participated in the Anglo-Cherokee War in the British militia, were actually denied their freedom, including a figure known as Joe Fleming. Furthermore, many Cherokee who had accepted runaway slaves into their communities, in fact, one Cherokee chief had an adopted son who had been a runaway slave, were forced by these treaties to return many, if not most, of these escaped slaves to the British government in South Carolina and Georgia and such, resulting in brutal punishments on these runaway slaves, and many of them being entered into brutal work camps. Furthermore, the sale of slaves after the Anglo-Cherokee War actually began to increase. And you can see some of these ads right here. I apologize for the words that are in them, but they are essentially what was going on at the time. In fact, one estimate shows that over 3,000 slaves a month were imported into South Carolina from 1763 to the Revolutionary War. However, it should also be noted that while this was going on, raids on the Savannah River Basin in South Carolina and Georgia by Maroon runaway communities were actually increasing as well from 1775 to from 1755 to 1756, and they were raiding quite a few plantations and cities and such. But also, unfortunately, this just led to further brutal measures against slaves who were either there or were being imported. And it also didn't help that slaves, as well as British colonists, during the Anglo-Cherokee War, were actually dying by the thousands due to a large smallpox epidemic, which was one of the main reasons that the South Carolina government was angry at the British government, because they felt the British did not provide them aid for this smallpox epidemic in time. They felt they needed help, and the British government wasn't there for that. And that's not to say, how the African Americans who were enslaved must have felt. I can only imagine the horror and terror that they were feeling because of, one, the brutal measures, two, the war that was going on, the two wars that were going on, the Cherokee War as well as the 7 Years' War, and the brutal measures being put on them by their masters. Needless to say, these events, both the Anglo-Cherokee War and the fears of a slave revolt on the level of the Second Maroon War in Jamaica, as well as the Proclamation of 1763, eventually led to what we would know as the Revolutionary War. Now, of course, they weren't the only factors. I mean, the whole taxation without representation and various other things. But for South Carolina and Georgia, at least, these were by far one of the major factors. So the Anglo-Cherokee War, and the fact that the Cherokee and the other tribes in Pontiac's Confederation got what they wanted, the fact the British weren't there for them during the smallpox epidemic, and the fact that there were several free Black communities hiding in the swamps of Georgia and North Carolina, that led to these massive fears of slave uprisings that they felt the British were also not helping them put down enough, led to the resentment and the discontent that in turn led to the British, the revolution against the British. So with that ends my first video on the Black History Month subjects. I have 2 more planned as the month goes on. So again, happy Black History Month, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and please like, share, and subscribe.